On a cold October night in 1919, an army led by a Tsarist naval admiral, escorting an armoured train, quietly departed from Kazan, Russia, following the Trans-Siberian Railway towards the northeastern border of China. This train carried 500 tons of gold, a portion of the Russian Empire's gold reserve under Tsar Nicholas, too originally plundered from the populace. This was the final legacy of the last Tsar following the outbreak of the February Revolution in Russia. The gold was being moved urgently amid a perilous situation. However, this train ultimately vanished in Siberia. The 500 tons of gold also disappeared without a trace, becoming an unsolved mystery, and there are various theories about this gold. Today, we will talk about the Tsar's gold. In the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe and North America, feudal society was profoundly impacted. The wave of capitalism swept across the world. By the early 20th century, the once mighty Russian Empire had also reached its end. The February Revolution, which erupted in 1917, directly led to the abdication of the last Tsar, Nicholas II. Under an agreement with the provisional government, Nicholas II and his family could still maintain their royal lifestyle and take necessary personal belongings from the palace, along with many servants. But for the last Tsar, the most important thing was the 500 tons of gold from the imperial reserve. Before the outbreak of World War I, Tsarist Russia possessed the third largest gold reserve in the world, surpassed only by the United States and France. After World War I began, Nicholas II moved this gold from the then capital, St. Petersburg, to Kazan and stored it in the Kazan Bank. This was because Kazan, located in central western Russia, was far from the battlefield. With the tacit permission of the provisional government, Nicholas II was able to retain this gold. But a few months later, the October Revolution erupted. The proletarian revolution led by Lenin overthrew the provisional government, and a Soviet government was established. At that time, the force fighting against the Soviet Red Army was the White Army, also known as the White Guard, comprising royalist armies, loyal to the Tsar. Because the Tsar was also called the White Tsar, and white was the color representing the Tsar, this army was called the White Army. Kazan at that time was also under the control of the White Army, but as the Red Army advanced closer to Kazan, this gold was also in jeopardy. And the Red Army's focused attack on Kazan was aimed at capturing this gold, because at that time, whoever possessed the gold would have enough money to buy weapons and recruit troops, and ultimately win this civil war. After a fierce battle with the White Army, the Red Army captured Kazan, but when they entered the vault of the Kazan Bank, they found it empty. It turned out that before the Red Army attacked Kazan, the White Army had secretly moved the gold to a more distant city, Omsk. Here, we must mention one person, and that is Admiral Kolchak, who was the supreme commander of the White Army at the time. He was a naval admiral during the Tsarist era. During World War I, his fleet in the Baltic Sea achieved many victories. He was eventually promoted to commander of the Black Sea Fleet. After the provisional government was established, following the February Revolution, he was the first high-ranking Tsarist officer to swear allegiance to the provisional government. He said, "I serve not this form of government or another form of government, but I serve the motherland, which I hold above all else." However, the weakness and incompetence of the provisional government caused Kolchak to lose all hope. He was also dismissed from his post and sent to the United States for a military survey. However, at this moment, the proletarian government, led by Lenin, overthrew the provisional government. Kolchak, passing through Japan on his way back home, considered himself a representative of the legitimate government that had been overthrown and believed it was necessary to fight against the new regime. Therefore, he launched a coup in Siberia, proclaiming himself the supreme ruler of Russia and supreme commander-in-chief of all armed forces. Thanks to his prestige and influence, the White Army forces at the time also followed his command. He once occupied Siberia, the Urals, and the Volga River region, wielding a very large force. In a short period, Kolchak built an army of several 100,000 men. In the spring of 1919, he launched a full-scale offensive from east to west. He intended to fight from Siberia all the way to St. Petersburg to re-establish the Russian Empire. And in Omsk, Siberia, he established an independent government. But by then, the morale of the White Army was low, lacking unified command, suffering more losses than victories. In the Battle of the Belaya River, Kolchak's most elite forces were completely annihilated by the Red Army, which was extremely poorly equipped. From then on, the main force of the White Army was wiped out. The White Army could not recover from this blow, suffering continuous defeats. Before the Red Army captured Kazan, Kolchak had already moved the gold from the bank's treasury in Kazan to Omsk, the seat of his government. In October 1919, Kolchak's army was defeated again at Omsk. Thus began the Great Siberian Ice March. Dozens of trains filled with soldiers, refugees, and various goods headed east into Siberia, and Kolchak was on a fully armed train. On this train were the 500 tons of Nicholas's gold. He intended to take this gold to Siberia to prepare for a future comeback. The army following Kolchak numbered over 500,000 men, along with 750,000 exiles who opposed the proletariat and were nostalgic for the Tsar. These 1.25 million people were then crossing a 6,000-kilometer stretch of Russian territory. Various cars, trains, and horse-drawn carriages transported these people as they retreated eastward. It was winter in Russia. The average temperature was -20 degrees Celsius. Although at the beginning of the journey, this temperature was not unusual for people who lived in Russia year-round. It was nothing strange. But after these more than 1 million people had been traveling for just a few days, the temperature in Russia plummeted from -20 to a sudden -40 degrees. The biting wind howled, and blizzards cut like saws. Many people froze to death during the escape. On the endless Siberian snowfields, the frozen bodies, abandoned sleighs, and frozen horses littered the road leading to Siberia. As for Kolchak's gold train, it reached a small city called Tomsk, only to discover that in this city, no coal could be found for the train. With the Red Army in hot pursuit, there was no time to search for coal. Left with no choice, Kolchak ordered all the gold bars to be loaded onto horse-drawn sleighs, and they continued on foot. The severe cold caused the Siberian horses pulling the sleighs to also die in droves. People moved forward, inch by inch, like walking zombies. The number of evacuees dwindled each day at an ever-increasing rate. They had encountered a once-in-a-century Siberian winter. In a single night, 200,000 people froze to death. By the end of January 1920, this group of 1.25 million people at the start of the journey had been reduced to just 250,000. These people, after immense hardship, finally made it from Omsk to Lake Baikal, a distance of 2,000 kilometers. To save time, Kolchak ordered a crossing over Lake Baikal. The 80-kilometer wide surface of the lake was covered in a 3-meter thick layer of ice. The 250,000 survivors and the army escorting the 500 tons of gold began to cross the ice. And at this time, on Lake Baikal, the temperature had dropped to -69 degrees Celsius. These 250,000 people had just stepped onto the ice, and before they had gone far, they were frozen solid on the lake's surface by a blizzard. The soldiers escorting the gold, to save their own lives, abandoned the gold bars. They too scattered and fled. Seeing this, Kolchak completely gave up on the gold, and with the remaining men, discarded their heavy loads and retreated to Irkutsk, a city next to Lake Baikal. A few months after Kolchak fled to Irkutsk, an uprising broke out there, and he and a group of high-ranking generals were captured. Members of the Cheka from Moscow interrogated them for 2 weeks and learned the whereabouts of the gold. Finally, an urgent telegram was sent from Moscow, ordering Kolchak's secret execution, and by the time the Red Army reached Lake Baikal, it was the following spring. The gold on the lake's surface had long since sunk to the bottom, and because Lake Baikal is so vast and over 700 meters deep, recovering this gold was impossible. Thus, this gold vanished forever from people's sight. For over 95 years, countless treasure hunters have tried to find the whereabouts of the Tsar's gold in Lake Baikal, but all have failed. In 2011, a Russian exploration company used the Mir-2 mini-submarine to descend to a depth of 600 meters in Lake Baikal. Underwater, they discovered some shiny metallic objects that looked like gold. This news made headlines at the time. International media, with large headlines, "Lost Tsar's Gold Found in Lake Baikal," reported on the event. But when the submarine pilot tried to use the mini-sub's robotic arm to pick up these shiny objects, the objects seemed to be stuck to some rocks, making them very difficult to retrieve. However, the company has identified the location and is trying to recover a sample. Another theory suggests that that year, Kolchak, on his retreat, was betrayed by his allies. When the gold train reached Tomsk, he was captured by a secret Red Army unit stationed there, and the gold train was seized. Kolchak was later transferred to Irkutsk for execution. The so-called gold in Lake Baikal is just a baseless rumor, and the Red Army's government at the time was unstable, facing threats from both outside and within, so they did not announce the seizure of this gold. As for the owner of this gold, the last Tsar, Nicholas, from the moment he was forced to abdicate, had absolutely no connection to this gold. The provisional government at the time tried to provide them with a living environment befitting their royal status, but because the provisional government lacked real power, its ideals could not be realized. Revolutionary activities in St. Petersburg were happening one after another. At the demand of workers and soldiers, the provisional government was forced to arrest and place Nicholas and his family under house arrest at the Alexander Palace in Tsarskoye Selo. The provisional government, fearing for the royal family's safety, decided to send Nicholas and his family to England, because England had long been a constitutional monarchy, and the royal family was still preserved. And the King of England at the time was George V. King George V and Nicholas II were cousins. Nicholas II's family also wanted to go abroad quickly. Moreover, the British Parliament had already approved, allowing Nicholas II and his family to seek exile in England. But King George V, considering his own interests, feared that the arrival of Nicholas II would cause a political crisis, or even a revolution, because British trade unions at the time were sympathetic to the proletarian party of Lenin, the Bolsheviks. Therefore, King George V ultimately rejected this resolution from Parliament. Nicholas's exile abroad did not succeed. So the provisional government considered another plan, to move Nicholas II to Tobolsk in Siberia. This place was far from the political center and relatively safe. Afterward, the entire family of Nicholas II was moved to Tobolsk. They spent several peaceful months there, although their hearts were still filled with fear. But fortunately, due to the strict guards, they remained safe. However, not long after, the October Revolution led by Lenin broke out. This revolution overthrew the bourgeois provisional government, establishing a proletarian government. To prevent the Tsar's family from being rescued by the White Army, Nicholas's family was again escorted to Yekaterinburg and imprisoned in a mansion. High walls were built around the mansion. The windows were sealed, and it was heavily guarded by soldiers. Here, the Tsar's family became true prisoners. There were 7 members of the Tsar's family here, including Nicholas II, the Empress, the Tsarevich, and 4 Grand Duchesses, along with their 4 loyal servants. They had only a very limited amount of time each day to walk outside. Their food was black bread, stew, soup, and tea. In the late night of July 16th to the early morning of July 17th, 1918, the head of the Soviet-Russian Cheka at the time, Yakov Yurovsky, informed Nicholas II's family that they had to move temporarily. Along with their servants, he herded all 11 of them down to the mansion's basement. After being locked here all night, at dawn, Yurovsky led 8 armed soldiers into the basement and closed the door. He then pulled out a document and announced on the spot the execution of Nicholas's family. Nicholas II was stunned upon hearing this and quickly asked, "What?" Before he could finish, Yurovsky pointed his pistol at Nicholas II and fired. The guards also immediately opened fire on them, turning the basement into an execution ground. Their bodies were doused with gasoline and burned. What remained was buried in an abandoned mine shaft in the Yekaterinburg area. This included Nicholas II, the 4-year-old Tsarevich Alexei, and the 4 daughters. The urgent execution of Nicholas II's family was because the White Army was approaching. If any member of the Tsar's family survived, they would receive support from European royalty to become a government in exile, threatening the revolutionary gains of Russia at the time. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for over 300 years, ended in this way. Except for a few relatives who had gone abroad, Nicholas II's family left no descendants, and Nicholas II, much like the fate of the 500 tons of gold, was swallowed by the currents of history. If the power and money a person possesses are completely beyond their control, then when the country and society are in peril, that money and power will surely be reclaimed in some way. Money and power are both sharp weapons and deadly poisons. If not controlled well, they will lead to ruin. Therefore, cherishing the peaceful life before us is what we should pursue. Today's video ends here. If you also liked my video, please give me a like, save, and comment. See you in the next one.